It sounds like the community college system needs more than Band-Aids, like major restructuring. One of the things that we've spoken of in a previous open classroom was totally reorganizing it along the model of the vocational technical high school system. Are there any thoughts about doing this and how it might work?
Yeah, that's
That should be up.
that's a really good question because that's something that I'm just delving into, and so I've had a number of conversations with community college presidents around the Commonwealth to talk about that, particularly because I felt like I was talking out of school at first when I sort of threw up strengthen the community college system, and then our director said, "What does that mean?" I said, "I don't know." And it was interesting in talking to them. A lot of people bring to bear North Carolina as like a shining example of like best practice for a community college system. But North Carolina really grew out of a technical system. Like their community college system was really a technical vocational system, not meant, and it's still largely not driven by general liberal arts associate's degree holders. And there's a sense among the community college presidents here that that's not the way to go, that is not their population, that they're not serving vocational technical students. They are serving students who want a more general associate's degree or who want specific training in a profession or an occupation, like the nursing programs, dental hygienist programs. There's a number of sort of more technical occupation-driven programs that are very successful but are not necessarily vocational technical. So I think right now with the Vision Project, there's a push for more coordinated leadership. I don't know how far they can take it. So I know that the chancellor is looking to the community colleges, to the presidents to step up to the plate and coordinate among themselves in terms of letting students transfer credits from one community college to another. Like, believe it or not, that's a hard thing to do, to have the same admissions placement tests. That's not uniform. Let alone get similar coursework going on in each of the community colleges, or even similar types of partnerships with local businesses. And so what's kind of coming out right now in terms of developing legislation is a carrots and sticks approach. And one being, right now we're going to hold your funding kind of level and we're going to suggest that you do these things, but in the future we're going to be paying incentives for you to be doing these types of things. But it doesn't seem like they're going to be able to just take over the community college system and dictate what happens, because they each have their own boards and they're very separate entities here.
If I could add to that, from having remembered, I think it was when Charlie Lyons and Paul Harrington spoke here. And Charlie Lyons is a really dynamic guy. I don't know if you've ever met him. He's the superintendent of the Shawshene Valley Voc-Tech system, one of the best in the state. And apparently, I learned that we have a really strong regional Voc-Tech system in the state at the high school level. And he gave a glimpse of kind of his leadership, because he told that each of his program heads, they had to achieve a certain rate of placement into jobs upon completion. Like their students had to, and it was a pretty high rate, like 80, 90%. And he kind of threatened them, if they didn't meet those goals, he would shut their program down. So all these program heads developed strong relationships with employers to directly get their graduates straight into jobs.
Completion is a big part of the puzzle, and so the legislation that's being crafted now that I've seen, completion is certainly one of the measures that's in there. There's a little bit of an issue though for the community colleges in terms of measuring completion, because even the rates that I showed you there were a little disingenuous in that those rates are reported by the National Center for Education Statistics, and the completion rates are only for first-time freshmen in community colleges, which I just told you were only 20%, right, of the student body. And what happens is a lot of those first-timers, some will drop out, but others will transfer, or they will get a job, or some other outcome that doesn't lead to an associate's degree, or they'll finish their certificate but not the associate's degree. That only measures completion of the associate's degree. So you have a lot of community college presidents saying, you can't measure us by that, that's not fair, it's apples and oranges. And so there's a push at the national level to develop metrics that appropriately measure what they do. So I think that's a piece of it too.
Up here and then there.
I was wondering a lot about how VocaTech programs are going to play into this, because you mentioned a few times about having a gap between having these technical jobs filled. And I know my brother's in a plumbing program at a VocaTech high school, and his high school has a really big med tech program that sends students into different certificates depending on where they are, but they get a general med tech their first 2 years and then go into a certificate. So I was just wondering about that, because that's sort of that high school range that we didn't really look at.
Yeah, well, the VocaTechs are, one of the better shining examples in this middle skill category, but they are vocational high schools, so they're only getting that high school crowd. And right now, if you just trained those that are entering the labor force, that's only going to fill like maybe a third of the gap at best. So what the SkillsWorks campaign and some of that legislation that's being crafted is looking at the existing skills in the existing labor force and trying to move some of those individuals who are already adults and they're out of high school into certificate programs, or what's called stackable credentials, where now they'll take an associate's degree, particularly in a field like nursing or some other kind of technical type of program, and break it into smaller chunks where they get a certificate for completing a certain amount of coursework that then they can go back to their job or take a break or whatever it is that happens typically along the way, and then come back to complete the second level of the certificate and eventually get themselves to an associate's degree. So they're trying to really think about how do we give individuals who are beyond high school that kind of training. But the VocaTech, that's one of the strengths that we do have.
My name is Julia Geisman. I have two questions actually. One is towards you, Alicia. Has there been any thought given to looking outside of the United States for models around, community college types of things? For example, I know in Denmark, many years ago, they used to have folk high school, which was very much a VocaTech type of approach. So that's one question. And then the second question, since I'll just put it out here right now, Alan, you painted a kind of a doom and gloom scenario. Is Massachusetts particularly unique in the issues that we're facing, especially around healthcare, or is it really all over the country?
You raise a really good question, one that I don't know a lot about. I don't know a lot about community college systems in other countries. My sense is there are some really good examples out there, and recently the Harvard Graduate School of Education came out with a report called Pathways to Progress that's gotten a lot of media coverage, and basically comes out with the conclusion that four-year college programs are not for everybody, and we better start thinking about the two-year programs. And when I read it, I was like, hey, how did they get so much press for that? Well, we came out with this 6 months ago. But what they do, and that's different in that report, is there is a section about other models in other countries that I have to admit I have not read carefully enough to really give you a sense of what's out there. But that's a good place to look if you're looking for more information about that.
No, well, I just wonder if the community colleges are even beginning to use that resource, because I mean, all you know is what you know is what you know, and where's the innovation behind it, unless you really reach beyond borders.
My sense is, in talking to the 3 or 4 presidents that I have, is that they are stretched so thin right now, and particularly with the way the state's finances are, that they're even facing more cuts, that they don't even have the time or the finances to be thinking about innovating, because they're cutting back on student services and they're raising fees, and they're trying to make do with very limited space for growing enrollment. So I think the problem is right now everything feels very short-sighted, but I think that would be a good place to look.
Okay, is Massachusetts unique? It's a little unique in the short to medium term, but not really in the long term. We do have an older population than the national average, although the population of the whole U.S. is aging. The baby boom phenomenon is a U.S. phenomenon. So we're a little bit older, so we'll feel a little bit more of that decline in the labor force because of aging. because we're older, perhaps higher healthcare expenditures a bit on that regard, although we're also more highly educated, and a more highly educated population probably has fewer health problems. But what does make Massachusetts a bit unique in the short to medium term is our state healthcare program. Right. So one of the reasons that healthcare costs have been rising particularly rapidly here in the last few years is because of that program and the combination of that and the recession. So that's resulted in sharp increases in the number of people who are using Mass Health.
Is that going to shift if, when, hopefully there's a national health care program, will that defray some of the expenses that Massachusetts is bearing now?
I don't know. I mean, it will make the states look more like us, but I don't know the details. With lower healthcare costs here, I don't know. Ultimately, economists are feeling that there will have to be a slowing down in healthcare costs, and that's what most people are projecting in the long term, simply because the market will, households will demand it, and the market will enforce it, and then that will affect Medicare and Medicaid as well. But we're talking decades out.
But the state is trying to address the cost problem now with looking at global payment systems. So I think actually they've come out with a global payment system, right, for Mass Health?
I think they're coming out.
Right, so global payments meaning that they pay a fixed price for services rather than a fee-for-service type of situation. So they're not rewarding quantity, they're trying to just reward quality in terms of care. So rather than a physician getting paid for every single service that they do, they give them one global fixed payment for a patient, manage their care, kind of going back to nobody wants to say HMO, but it's very similar to the HMO type of model.
Okay, over here.
Yes, I think this is mostly for Alan, but I was very impressed with the computation, and I didn't understand all the details that are making these projections. And so my question is that how much uncertainty, can you give some sort of professional estimate of the amount of uncertainty involved? Because here we have these iterations over 20 years based on, in many cases, historical data from 5 or 10 years ago. And I just didn't know.
Right. Well, the uncertainty is so uncertain that it can't be quantified. The way to address, well, sure there is uncertainty, and it when you look at the projection methodology, it's so simply based that it has an error. The question is, how big is the error? For example, it assumes that migration patterns, which are very critical to population growth, are like the average that they have been over the past several decades. Well, that could change, and that could change simply because the baby boomers are aging, and as we age, we may leave room for younger people to be able to migrate here as the cost of living falls. So there are all those kinds of errors. The way to handle those kinds of uncertainties is by alternative simulations. And I did one, actually, for this exercise. I didn't report it. And it had to do with the labor force or the employment rates. I had not extrapolated the BLS projections beyond 2018, but I did an alternative one where I let the labor force participation rates continue to change as they had. That's particularly important because labor force participation rates are expected to rise for older workers for various reasons. And so I did that alternative simulation, and that's typically the approach that is used when you have this kind of uncertainty. The bottom line there was it didn't change the results much.
Okay.
How's everyone doing? My name is Maxwell O'Hara. I'm a senior at Roxbury Community College. I have two questions for tonight. My first question is, does race play an effective role in determining whether demographics will bankrupt Massachusetts? And my second question is there a chance for equal opportunity?
All right, those are, okay, hard and very important questions. Does race play a role in these projections? With regard to race, these projections are in effect assuming the status quo. So in terms of employment status, in terms of educational attainment, job picture, health status, it's essentially projecting the status quo because of the way these projections were made. That said, race could play an important role, not just race but also ethnicity, because of the growth we're going to have in the minority population and the potential which we're not using in the minority population, and this is all tied to education and social policy. Andy Sum was here, or Paul Harrington was here. They must have talked about low high school graduation rates in the metro areas of Massachusetts, for example. So there's an incredible amount of underused capacity in the central cities in Massachusetts. So it can play an important role if government policy keeps putting their foot on the accelerator of education reform, including especially K through 12, but also these two-year colleges and public universities and preschool to tap this underutilized potential. So race doesn't play a role in my projections, but it could play an important role in avoiding some of the pain that these projections imply.
You raise a really good question because I didn't go through the methodology of my projections at all. I just made you guys take a leap of faith with me, but I follow the same methodology that Alan laid out, that the Census Bureau and the BLS do. But because I was very interested in the changing composition of the labor force and how that would change educational attainment, we didn't use the census projections. We created our own projections based on their cohort component methodology, where we, instead of breaking it just by breaking the population down by age and sex, we broke it down by age, sex, race, ethnicity, and nativity. And we used fertility rates and mortality rates and rates of educational attainment associated with each of those groups by 5-year age groups going out. So that's how I was able to show you those pictures, those pie charts of how the composition of the labor force is going to change. And so in terms of the workforce, it's definitely going to have a big impact if we don't address the opportunity question that you raised, because if we just held constant the educational attainment of these different groups and just assigned them to those that are going to be entering the labor force. So for example, among Hispanics, roughly 50% graduate from high school. If we apply that going forward, then that's where we get educational attainment slowing to a halt. And you'll see going from 2009 to 2019 to 2029, the percentage of the population that has a high school degree falls, and the percent that's less than high school rises. And so I think that's an important piece of the discussion here, and that's why near the end of my talk, where I was talking about how we really paid attention to the high skill part of our educational system in terms of the 4-year colleges. I think a lot of times in Massachusetts we rely on private colleges. I've had lawmakers tell me, when it's time to cut the budget and they decide to cut some out of higher ed, everybody sort of feels like it's okay because we have Harvard and MIT, and Northeastern and whatever, right? But nobody's thinking about the fact that when you cut funding to UMass, you're cutting it to certain groups, right? I mean, individuals who are going or relying on publicly funded institutions are those that most need that funding. And he said, we don't even think about community colleges. Like, mostly we're just thinking about, how much is UMass going to get less? Nobody's thinking about the community college system at all. And so he suggested that we should stop thinking about education as K through 12 and higher ed, because that leaves that donut hole, the community colleges, that we should think K through 14 as an alternative.
seemed like community colleges had districts, or elected board members. It was almost like a school board for community college, and I think part of the revenue was somewhat similar to K-12 in terms of property tax and so on, the rest of the state. But California is definitely a whole, although they're in big trouble, right? You talk about bankruptcy.
Yeah.
But at least historically, they've invested much more in community colleges than our state.
I have a question about Fidelity moving the jobs out. Do you think this symptomizes that the cost of adding value to the economy, the public cost, is making us uncompetitive, or do you think this is just an isolated case?
You know, it's interesting because there's a lot of studies out there about why firms move jobs or where they decide to locate. And human capital is a big part of that decision-making process. It's one of the biggest, other than natural resources or being close to a nexus of transportation and things like that. I mean, for the industries that are here in Massachusetts, like the financial services industry, healthcare, education, mostly it's about the brain power that's here. So it's interesting to me that the jobs at Fidelity are moving. A small part of the number of jobs from the Middleborough facility is going to Boston, and that's basically your fund managers, kind of your highly skilled individuals. And the rest of the jobs that are more the call center jobs are going to Rhode Island and New Hampshire. And I think it is a combination of factors of cost advantages, and then they're also going to be cutting, or they have over time cut, I think over 30,000 jobs due to technology, right? So now they're implementing the technology that allows individuals who have accounts with Fidelity to manage their own accounts and make trades, right? I can make trades from my phone now. And so I don't need to go through the call center, and I don't even want to talk to a person. So you're finding that employment in that category, that sector of jobs, is shrinking as well. And it is a business decision of where they can place them to make them the most cost effective. So I can't tell you if it's taxes or if it's the cost of living or what it might be, but I don't think it's a skills issue at this point.
Hi, Franco with economics undergrad. I had two questions, one for each of you. For Alicia, I recall looking at one of the slides that projected the mismatch of labor demand and supply in 2019, I believe. Looking at it, it said that some college, the demand for some college degree individuals is really high, and there's a mismatch because there's really low supply for it. Therefore, we're talking about vocational and technical schools. On the other hand, for high skill, especially for bachelor's degrees, there's an oversupply, it looks like. Is there a possibility that instead of the vocational and technical school individuals filling these jobs that are unfilled, that the undergrads who just graduated would fill these? So that's one question I had for you. For Professor Clayton-Matthews, I was wondering if the Universal Health Care Act just sort of went through and had with no glitches by 2014, if that had any implications to your projections for the Massachusetts budget.
So that's a good question, and I think during my talk I alluded to it, but it's a really good question in light of the recession and individuals such as yourself who may be graduating soon. And I think to a certain extent, we could expect, that is, one of the potential market forces that can fill this gap to some extent is we would expect individuals who are just graduating from college to be willing to take a job that maybe doesn't require a 4-year degree. It could be anything in the financial services sector that's more clerical rather than actuarial or whatever it might be. But at least in my mind, that's a pretty temporary phenomenon, I think, associated with the recession right now. And I would think, given the choice, if a year down the road you had a job opportunity that drew on the skills that you earned here and would earn you a higher wage, It would allow you to pay back potentially a student loan that you might have, that you would probably take that job opportunity and you wouldn't be staying in that middle skill job. The other thing is that individuals such as yourself who are highly educated, you know, you don't only have job opportunities in Massachusetts. You can go to New York, you can go to California, you can go to Hong Kong, you can go wherever you want, pretty much. You have a lot of opportunities, and you're highly skilled and also able to get information about where those job opportunities are. So given the fact that we've seen a lot of college-educated workers leave Massachusetts in the past, I think if we don't have the right jobs to match up with their skills, they might temporarily take these middle skill jobs, but I don't think we can rely on that as a solution in the long run.
Now, Franco, what was that question about the universal health care law?
Well, so I'm not too familiar with healthcare. I just know that the healthcare law hasn't fully been implemented until 2014. 2015, is that
okay.
it?
The federal law.
Yeah, the federal law.
Well,
yeah.
I am not familiar with it either. So I'm really pretty ignorant about what that effect would be. And there's an answer here?
Well, healthcare's my other love, so I'll jump in. From what I know of the federal law, and I haven't read through all 3,000 pages of the document, but the law does do some things that economists think should lower healthcare costs, right? So they're trying to do things like use best practices in terms of treatments, right? In terms of reimbursing physicians for treatments. They should be following certain practice guidelines rather than jumping to maybe some more expensive types of procedures, et cetera. But by and large, we don't know how much these things are actually going to save, and they haven't really been proven to save very much in the aggregate. Like, you can take an individual sort of service or an individual treatment, in cardiovascular care, right? For example, if somebody comes into the ER with chest pain, like giving them an aspirin, right, can alleviate some of the most potentially damaging effects of a heart attack. So simple things like that. Hand washing, right? That was the other thing that was really big in terms of reducing hospital-acquired infections. So there's simple things like that that can, save us dollars, and certainly, make simplifying the system will also help us save dollars. But it's really hard to, I think that's the problem with healthcare, is there's no one single thing that you can say, if we do this, we're gonna cut costs by 20%. It's that's kind of marbled throughout the entire system. And so you really have to be cutting it kind of surgically. And the Obama law is very much like the Massachusetts healthcare law. It does address costs, at least to some degree, whereas in Massachusetts we didn't address it at all. But really the focus is on access. And when you increase access, you put more people in the system, more dollars get spent. So right now, the CBO projects that, in the long term, it will save some in terms of healthcare costs, but I don't think that is something to rely on in terms of trying to fix the long-term problems that Alan raised.
There is an upside to this healthcare crisis for Massachusetts, and that is, we saw that why are healthcare costs rising so much? Because of technology, the demand for better and better healthcare. Well, we're one of the centers of that technology, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and biotechnology. So, although it is a huge national and state problem, we probably benefit from it to a much greater degree than many other areas of the country.
Here.
Hi, my name is Charles Wogorowski, and I live in Boston and here as a community member. When I think about this, I was just toying intellectually with the train wreck scenario, and saying, let's suppose this is right, and that we'll have a huge mismatch of education and also with healthcare. So that to me then precipitates a political crisis. There's a society that will have to do something about that. And what it suggests to me is that the forces that I see at play are the plutocracy. Are we going to continue to have inequality and cut programs? Or in fact, with changing demographics, will there be a whole group of people who come together and say, well, we're not going to put up with this? That I can set. When I hear about Social Security retirement ages getting kicked up to 60, it's given my age, and I'm saying, those bastards, they're increasing my retirement age. Like, you do that enough, and people like me at the end of the baby boom, and there's a lot of people, like, and I have a lot of friends in the baby boom, and we know how to get politically organized. I can imagine a political movement on the liberal side that says, no, we're not going to put up with these cuts, and we're going to cut nuclear warheads and aircraft carrier. I mean, that's not inconceivable today, but I don't, does that make sense to you? That this to me looks more like a political crisis rather than an economic. Because there's too much going in play. And anyway, I'm going to stop there.
I think in terms of the mismatch, the unfortunate thing is there's no natural lobbyists like the AARP is out there for raising the Social Security age. I mean, they're a really powerful lobby, and yeah, I think they've probably held down raising the Social Security age more than anything. Even though there have been changes, they haven't been as drastic as policymakers might have wanted to make them. But I don't think there's any natural advocacy group out there for individuals who are in these middle skill sort of categories, in these middle skill jobs. That's what some of what is going on right now in Massachusetts with the Skills to Compete campaign is trying to argue that it's actually for the greater good that we provide these individuals with this middle skill training, because it's going to benefit us in terms of economic growth in the long run. And that sounds like a great argument, but if you ask me to quantify that, I really couldn't. I couldn't tell you like how much more productive our workforce would be, or how many more jobs would be here rather than going to Rhode Island or New Hampshire. It's a really hard thing to quantify, and I think because of that, it doesn't get like a natural advocacy organization behind it, and it takes a lot of different groups working together to make anything happen. I don't know.
Yeah, well, we're seeing the political ramifications of this recession, right, and how it affects people's pocketbooks. We're seeing that across the country. The movement to cut costs will probably also affect healthcare and all kinds of pocketbook issues as well. But I'm an economist. I'm not a political analyst. But let me say a couple things about the economic forces behind two issues here. One is jobs and skills, and the other will be about healthcare. But in terms of the outlook for Massachusetts in terms of high-skilled jobs, whether they be middle or very high-skilled, we've been in a trend over the past several decades, and it's a globalization trend. And the state's economy, in terms of technology, has transformed over the past few decades from a declining manufacturing economy to a high-tech center. And that trend is likely to continue over the next couple decades at least, because of what's happening in the global economy. What's happening in the global economy is, as the world economy grows, it's like a pie or a cake that's growing, and there's a recipe into making the world output that pie. You throw in unskilled labor, you throw in skilled labor, and you throw in capital. And the developing nations of the world, particularly China and India, and Southeast Asia, have been throwing a lot of unskilled labor into that recipe. And so that demands the other ingredients to be put in, and the United States, and Massachusetts in particular, is well suited for those two other ingredients, which have been in short demand. That's the high skills and capital. That largely led our technological revolution, and explains why the upper income households in the state have done so well, and why the middle income jobs have left because of competition from the developing countries. So those trends are likely to continue, and I'm sure there are political ramifications for those as well. Now, in terms of the medical costs, the CBO is projecting that that these costs cannot continue to go on at these rates, simply because as the share of GDP that's going to for health expenditures, as that rises, it will eventually cut into real expenditures for everything else. And households and people in the market just won't put up with that. And so there will be a market enforcement on cutting healthcare costs. We might not see it for a couple of decades, but it will have to come, and it will come. And again, economists are looking at this, but it will probably result in political change, political demands and unrest that will bring those about.
Okay, I had one more question.
Hi, my name is Ted Wade. As we're baking the cake, Alan, I'm thinking about the Massachusetts relative competitiveness with other states and indeed around the world. And anecdotally, we have a lot of our higher skilled people and our students, after graduation, they leave the state because of a high cost of living and the high cost of housing. And we also anecdotally have the story of many industries not wanting to invest and come to Massachusetts, or they're moving out of Massachusetts because they're having difficulty attracting skilled labor. And so I wonder where those kinds of variables fit into your modeling and those sort of competitiveness factors for Massachusetts.
I can very briefly characterize what's happened over the last several decades, say from 1960 or 70, at least 2000. And that's been, yes, and even after 2000, yes, net migration has been a problem for Massachusetts. So we are losing a lot of highly skilled workers. But we've been losing lower educated households and lower skilled households at a faster rate than we have highly skilled households. And the net effect has been for the concentration of skills to have increased here over the decades. And if you look at one measure of that, for example, the proportion of the adult population with a college degree. In 1960, we were a Lake Wobegon state. We were above average, ranked about 14th in the nation in terms of that. By the year 2000, we were second in the nation, only second to Washington, D.C., which is full of lawyers, right? and I think that trend has continued through the 2000s. And when I looked at metropolitan areas across the country from 1970 to 2000 and looked at the proportion of the population with a college degree, with a 4-year college degree, I expected to see convergence in metropolitan areas. In other words, those metro areas with below average levels of educational attainment would grow faster. Those with very high levels would grow slower, and there'd be some convergence. What I found was exactly the opposite. There was divergence. And we're one of those points of divergence where we started Lake Wobegon above average and kept on moving up the scale. So again, it's this globalization phenomenon which is driving the development of our state's economy over the past several decades. Now, I suppose that could be a good thing as long as we devote the resources into our strength, which is education, and focus those resources on where we have the biggest potential, and that is in all the metro areas and regions of the state that have underperforming high schools, underperforming middle schools, and focus our resources on the preschool as well. If we concentrate on our strength, then as a Commonwealth we'll do fine. But it's been kind of a fascinating story in economic history to see how it developed.
I think the other thing to remember is that it can only go so far, and I think that's kind of what we're seeing now, where we went from, Lake Wobegon to really taking off, and now we have one of the most educated populations in the country. If you look But where we're missing or we're mismatching, and where the donut hole is in that middle skill piece. And what's really important to remember is that those jobs are often complementary to the high skill jobs, right? Hospitals need surgeons and they need surgical technicians, right? IT professionals need not only programmers, but they also need database administrators, computers, assistants and specialists and things like that. So, the thing is, we really need to grow our own in that regard, because we don't traditionally get very many people migrating into the state. Although at least in the current recession, we've been losing fewer and fewer people, but that's likely to turn around once other parts of the country recover. And we've been lucky because we've done slightly better than the nation during the recession, so people haven't been leaving as much as they have in the past. But once everybody else kind of catches up to us, and indeed if they do surpass us, then we might see those trends reverse. So I think it's important to remember to grow our own. And I guess one other thing that struck me that you mentioned was the talk about recent college graduates leaving because of the high cost of housing and high cost of living here. And it's certainly true that housing here is much more costly than in other parts of the country. I think we're second only to California and maybe one other place.
Housing prices rose faster here than any other state.
But the thing that's interesting, we did a study on recent college grads. Recent college grads, when they first come out of school, they're not buying a house, they're renting. And rents here, relative to income, are actually fairly comparable in terms of a cost of living index across the other parts of the country. And so if you, according to surveys that have been done of recent college grads, when you ask them, those who moved from state to state, why did you move? 60% of them moved because of job-related reasons, because they were offered a job somewhere, they're transferring to take a better job, etc. About 30% of them leave Massachusetts because they initially migrated in here to go to college, and so they're just going back home to live with mom and dad while they figure out what they're going to do. And about 10% move because of housing. So I think for that initial recent college grad group, it's not really cost of living and housing that's driving it, it's job opportunities. And if we don't have the right job opportunities for them, like that gentleman in the back, I think he'll find some place that does have the right job opportunity for him. But that's not to say that for sort of the other age groups, for example, the 35 and up category that is looking to buy that first house, that's a tough nut to crack around here, and they do often leave because of the high housing costs. So it's just.
All right, join me once again in thanking Alicia. Be sure to come back next week when the topic will be demographic change, politics, and national security, and the extent to which the demographic change nationally is going to impact politics, the next election, and beyond. Thanks.